So without further ado, I will hand it over to Jeannie.
Okay, so tonight we're going to learn about how to raise monarchs at home and raise and release only healthy monarchs. People ask me, why raise monarchs? There are so many animals that need help. Why go with a bug? And a lot of people see this as a bug, but when you look at any butterfly or pollinator, you should be seeing your favorite pair of jeans, your chocolate, your favorite fruit plate, because every third bite of food you eat has to be pollinated. And the monarch is what I consider to be America's butterfly, because there is hardly a part of the country, if there is a part, that is not touched by the monarch one way or another, either going on their northern migration or their southern migration. Before this, I had taught a class about sharks, but they're so dang hard to raise in your backyard. So I went to the other end of the food chain and started working with the monarchs. I had read about how much trouble they were in, and I thought, well, this is something I can do. I can do this in my backyard. So that's why monarchs. After doing some research on them, I thought, yep, this is the one for me. Just a minute here while I make sure. Oh, Katie, hold on. Having a little tech thing. Never mind. I figured it out. I was supposed to swipe left instead of right. I'm tech pathetic. Okay, so I found out that the monarch butterfly populations have dropped drastically, with overall numbers declining by 90% in the last 2 decades. 90%. I mean, 90% of anything being gone is a devastating number for that species. So the Xerces Society, which are the ones that are really in the know about the pollinators, estimated that the population in coastal California, which is the overwintering area of the western monarch, had dropped from 148,000 in 2017 to only 20,500 in 2018. Look at that drop over just 1 year. So the western population is now only 0.6% of it was what it was in the 80s. And last year was down another 22%. Okay, I should probably explain that there are 2 separate populations of monarch butterflies. There is the western population, and that is those that are west of the Rockies, and they will overwinter in California. The eastern population, which is everything east of the Rockies, are the ones that will make the migration to Mexico. But anyway, if that kind of trend continues, it will mean the end of the monarch butterfly. And I just don't think we can have that. And I think we can all help. So the monarch's in trouble. It was recently designated as an endangered species, but not in the United States. So that doesn't really affect anything that happens in this country until we declare it an endangered species. And it's way down on the list. I don't even remember what number it is, because in order to declare something an endangered species, we have to have money to protect it. And there are other populations that are in more trouble than the monarchs. But there is not a lot we can do with the other animals. However, we can help monarchs. And what I'm telling you applies generally to most butterflies, not just monarchs. So what's happening to them? Pesticides. I mean, I don't even want to get started on Monsanto and Roundup and all of those horrible things that people use that just kill off all of our insect population. They are non-discriminatory. Habitat destruction. Things like wildfires, bad weather, deforestation. I mean, we cause a lot of the habitat destruction ourselves. Climate change, because when the weather gets too hot, we've seen hardly any butterflies here this year. And I've got to think that one reason is that the temperatures have been so brutal. You still have to study things over decades before you find out a real trend, but things have not seemed to be improving as it continues to get hotter in the summer, colder in the winters, with more things like wildfires and floods and hurricanes and all of those on the increase. As far as herbicides and pesticides and all of that sort of stuff, even using them in your yard at all can be a problem, or even if your neighbors use them. Luckily, my neighbors all know that I raise butterflies, and they're very good about not using any pesticides that will drift over into my yard. And we live in a small sort of we have our own little kingdom here where I am, but there is no mosquito spraying and that sort of stuff that will also interfere with it. None of that happens in our little neighborhood. So that works out well. So another thing about the climate change is that if you have prematurely warm season, it causes the monarchs to migrate early. Well, if they do that, they've got nothing to eat. I mean, I saw a monarch in my yard last year in March. I don't have any milkweed in March. And I barely have any flowers in March. So that's where they start getting into trouble, is if they start flying north, they need places to lay eggs, they need things to eat. And if it's too early, they're not going to have them. The last year's counts in the California wintering grounds were particularly dismal. I don't know what they are for this year. The year before, they were down so low as to be non-existent. Some of the overwintering grounds in California, in the eucalyptus forest there, were at zero, where they had seen tens of thousands of monarchs the year before. Their counts were down to zero. Then last year it perked up just a little bit, and okay, that was 2 years ago. Last year it was back down. So it just kind of goes up and down, and you can't look at it 1 year and it's better and say, oh, okay, they're going to be all right, because next year it may take a 50% drop, and last year we dropped over 20%. If you're a butterfly, it's tough out there. So with butterflies, generally 1 in 100 of the eggs that they lay will become adult butterflies. I mean, there you are. That's not a very good statistic to start with. They have all sorts of things to deal with. There's wasps, spiders. Our friend the ladybug, she will, generally not bother them. However, she may now and then eat a monarch egg or a tiny larva or whatever. Milkweed bugs, which don't hurt the monarchs themselves, but they'll destroy your milkweed. Assassin bugs, all of those soldier bugs, stink bugs, all of that stuff, they're just horrible. And they have their own collection of diseases and parasites, and we'll talk a little more about those later. Things that eat monarch eggs for lunch are earwigs, stink bugs, and stink bugs, I think I have a picture of one later. They will also eat the adult, not the adult butterflies, but the big larvae. Ladybugs, ants. I had not really thought of ants as a problem until just a few years ago. I had a container out on my back porch. It was a Tupperware kind of thing. It had a layer of netting over the top. It had the lid over the top of the netting. And I had about 120 tiny, tiny little caterpillars in it. The next morning I went out and there were only about 20 left, and I could not figure out for what the world had happened to them. And then I took a close look, and there is a tiny little ant carting off my tiny little caterpillar. Now, these are the itty bitty ants, the ones, called sugar ants, piss ants, whatever is, your local term for them. And they were just carrying off my baby caterpillars. So now I don't leave them outside at all. This is a, a little wasp nest. I didn't know they ever built anything this small. This is on the back of a fig leaf. I found this year, and a single wasp makes this tiny little nest and puts her eggs in there, and then she carries the caterpillars in to feed to her larvae. So you can just look around your yard and find tiny little things that look harmless, but they're not. One of the worst ones, oh, here's my stink bug. One of the most common ones that I find in my garden are the stink bugs, soldier bugs, and other members of the same group. Now, you can see this stink bug at the top of this poor monarch, and this was a 4th or probably a 5th instar larva, and we'll talk about that too. And he stayed up there for 2 days and just sucked that caterpillar dry. I mean, it was just awful. So I hate stink bugs. This year we've had very few of them. I cut down the mulberry tree that they really, really liked, and I did not see very many stink bugs. The adult caterpillars also have their problems. Dragonflies will snatch them out of the air, as you can see in the picture. Praying mantids will get them. Cars are one of the biggest dangers to monarchs when they're migrating. You would never think of it, but they can be in a low tree or down in a field nectaring or whatever. And the next thing you know, they're taking off across a highway, and they get plowed down by the thousands by the traffic. So the things you don't think of are also big problems. Food shortages, of course, pesticides again. People look at things like it'll come to me, oh, BT, the Bacillus thuringiensis. And they say, well, it's an organic pesticide. Well, yeah, but it's a pesticide and it focuses on larvae. So even if you console yourself with the fact that you're using an organic pesticide, you're still killing them because they eat it and then they're gone. Again, bad weather, mice, birds, they have coloration that's supposed to discourage birds from eating them, but the birds will eat one and it may make them sick and they may not eat it again, but still if every bird eats one of them, there you are. The tachinid fly, we call it the tea fly among butterfly people. This fly deposits her eggs into the caterpillar, and the larvae grow inside the caterpillar and eventually hatch. Sometimes they'll hatch actually from the caterpillar, but usually they'll hatch from the chrysalis. So if you look at a chrysalis and you see this white thread coming out from the bottom, that is from the tachinid fly. And that is how the larvae are dropped to the bottom of the enclosure or to the ground or whatever. Fortunately, I've only had this happen one time and I did not see any of the larvae yet. I immediately disposed of the chrysalis and that was that. And then the biggest killer of monarchs is a parasite called OE. This is Ophriocistus electroschira. See, that biology degree I got did me at least a little bit of good because not only can I say that, I can spell it too. But this is a horrible parasite. And what happens is it is on the body of the adult monarchs and they will fly over the milkweed and sprinkle it like pixie dust. It is eaten by the caterpillars and it won't kill the caterpillars, but it will wait until they are in the chrysalis stage and then it will kill them. Or worse yet, if it doesn't kill them, you come out with a deformed butterfly, which also has the parasite on it. And if it's healthy enough that it can fly, and some of them are, just depends on how severe the disease is or the parasite is, then it will go ahead and spread them. And this is really important in places like Florida, where they have an overwintering population. Their monarchs don't migrate. So this disease just spreads like wildfire, and it's been estimated that between 95 and 99% of the butterflies in Florida are carrying this parasite. So I was really glad when we got out of Florida, and in the last several years, I have not had a single case of OE among my butterflies. So this is what happens. Their eclos usually very deformed. They can't fly, and they just have to be destroyed. Now you can significantly reduce the chances of OE if you bleach your milkweed and your butterfly eggs, which is a lot of trouble, but it will cut down on the amount of it. But like I said, here where we are, it's not that big a deal. And unless you're raising hundreds of them, it's not something you really have to think of doing. And I have monarch people who will argue with me till midnight, but that's okay. I've had really good luck just doing what I'm doing. Because the other way to keep it from being a problem is to raise them in very closed environments. But I've got to say this because it used to be the thought that, you know, if everybody raised all the monarchs they could and released them only healthy monarchs, that we would increase the population and make everything better. Studies over the past decade or so have found out that that's not necessarily true because, first of all, most people who are raising them at home, I think a lot of them are just doing it for bragging rights. Oh, I raised and released 500 monarchs this year. Well, did you test them all for OE first? Oh no, am I supposed to do that? How do I do that? So they're raising all of these butterflies and they're not making sure they're healthy before they release them and just continuing the problem. That, and we don't have enough milkweed and nectar flowers to feed the ones that we've already got. So all you're doing is releasing more monarchs that are going to be starving to death. So the Xerxes Society says, you know, just raise a few at home or in your schools or get your neighbors to raise them or whatever, but not more than about a dozen. And that way you can have the fun of raising them and you can make sure you're only releasing healthy ones. And for every healthy one you release, that's going to improve the situation for all of them. But don't raise hundreds of them. I used to do that and I'm not doing it anymore. So another problem, if I can get this to flip, okay, is called Black Death. Now, Black Death is not a disease or a parasite, it's a symptom. You can have a perfectly good caterpillar hanging at the top of its enclosure, and you go back a couple of hours later and this is what you've got. This is not a viable caterpillar. And there are generally two things it can be, but not always. There are some other things that arguably can cause Black Death, but usually it's a bacteria or a virus. The virus is the one that is really problematic, and it's called NPV, but usually it is only found in places where people are mass raising monarchs. So if it's like a production place that raises thousands of monarch eggs to ship out, or caterpillars or whatever to ship out to other places for butterfly releases and all of that stuff. And granted, I know that our butterfly house at the zoo would not have butterflies if it were not for this kind of company, because we order in all of ours. But NPV is extremely contagious. However, you can tell whether that's a problem because the caterpillar will stink. It has a very foul odor, and if you get that caterpillar, you have to destroy every caterpillar that's been in the enclosure with it, which is, another good reason not to be raising tons of caterpillars, especially if you don't really know what you're doing. So those are kind of the things that can go wrong. So if you're willing to just kind of grit your teeth and take your chances, here's what you do. First, you plant your butterfly garden. And they're attracted to all kinds of flowers. Some of the favorites are zinnias. Everybody can grow zinnias except apparently me, because not a single one of my seeds germinated this year, but neither did any of my other seeds. Usually I do fine with zinnias, but that's one of their favorite flowers, not just the monarchs, but all the butterflies. Butterfly weed, which is very easy to grow, and it is a type of milkweed. So they can not only nectar on this, but they can lay eggs on it too. So you have to watch that for eggs. Phlox, goldenrod, they absolutely love goldenrod. And the nice thing about this is it's a fall flower, so they can nectar on this as they're making their southern migration. So goldenrod's a real good one. Asters, same thing there. Lantana, our lantana stays late in the fall. Echinacea, another fall one. They love echinacea. Butterfly bush, more of a summer one, but still sometimes into the fall. Liatris, and even chives. You wouldn't think they would like the chive flowers, but they will nectar on chives. Then there is the milkweed. You cannot have enough milkweed. The more milkweed we plant, the better off we're going to be as far as the butterflies are concerned. So I tell people, plant as much milkweed as you have room for. There are all different kinds of native milkweeds. This is a picture of the common milkweed. The thing to remember when working with milkweed is always wash your hands. I always give this out as a cautionary note because it is a very powerful allergenic. Some people are very allergic to it. And if you're allergic to, a lot of different environmental things, then you might even want to wear gloves when you're working with it. But the real problem is getting the sap on your hands. You're outside working with your milkweed, you get some sap on the end of your finger. You're not thinking the sun is, or your face is sweating, you rub your eyes, and you've got the sap on your hands, and boom, this is what you've got. And this is not what anybody wants, because this is an immediate trip to the emergency room and a lot of medications and a very painful thing. So I always remind people to be sure and wash your hands when you're working with the milkweed. So this is the common milkweed. We see it growing along the highways here in North Carolina. I've got a lot of this planted in my front yard. It spreads by its roots, so it is very prolific, and it smells like heaven. The swamp milkweed is very popular here too. Although my butterflies like the common better, but they'll eat the swamp if they can't find anything else. Purple milkweed, they all have really pretty flowers. The showy, this is my favorite one, and this is not a native milkweed. This is the one we call hairy balls. It is a tropical milkweed, but my caterpillars and my butterflies love it. Yeah, I see you laughing, Linda. This is where they will always go first. And I think a lot of it is because of leaves are very tender. They're not heavy like those common milkweed leaves. So this is a real good place for those tiny little caterpillars. It's also called balloon milkweed, but we call it hairy balls because that's the seed pod. And that's what it looks like. So with milkweed has its own problems too. Comes the aphids, the dreaded aphid. Now look at this little guy. This is a microscopic picture that I took a couple of years ago. Looks like some cute little adorable alien from another planet, but I'll tell you what, these guys are the biggest pain. because one of them leads to this. And there's not really a lot that you can do to prevent aphids. Companion planting, some people say, helps with marigolds, and sunflowers sometimes make a good trap plant, but I can't get sunflowers because the deer eat them. So I just have to deal with them. So start with, in the very beginning, as soon as you see any milkweeds, squish them and rinse them. And people go, no, I can't stand squishing things. Well, I didn't like it either. But after a while, you've got to develop the mindset that it's like teeny tiny little bubble wrap. And it gets to be kind of a satisfying pop between your fingers, you know, and you know that you're helping your milkweed, because the butterflies don't like to lay their eggs on all of those aphids. So they'll look for someplace better. And even the aphids have their problems. So this is something you want in your garden. The ladybugs, because very rarely is she actually going to eat a butterfly egg. But you can see she's got this little aphid right there in her mouth, and she's just gobbling it down. This is one of my daughter's pictures. She is so good with that iPhone camera. Also, on the list of the good bugs, this is the hoverfly larva. And this guy will just chow down on aphids. I've got an amazing video of a hoverfly larva just going from aphid to aphid and just crunching on them, and they're just gone. So they're really good ones to have. So if you see this, this is among the good bugs. Oh, here you see one. And there he has that aphid in his mouth. This actually was my picture.
Good.
Okay, you look at this white, crazy looking thing in the corner. The first time I saw one of these, I went, what the heck is that? Because it looks like a down feather or something. It was in my driveway, and I thought the wind was moving around, and then I realized it was crawling. And this is actually the larva of the dusky ladybug. The one in the other corner, the one on the right, the orange and black one, that's our common ladybug larva. So if you see these, again, these are good bugs. Now this little guy, this looks like something nobody wants in their garden. Well, and it's generally called a trash bug, but this is actually the larva of the green lacewing. And you see all those things he's got covered all over him? Those are skeletons of aphids. So this is another one. In fact, I had a guy that I had shown this to, and he said, but I just moved one of those out of my garden. I said, well, go find it and put it back because you want it in there eating all those aphids. Aphids also are subject to parasitic wasps. So if you see this looks like these bugs are still alive, but these are actually mummified aphids. So with the aphids, the problem is that they excrete honeydew, which is a sticky, clear substance. And if they get enough of it on your plants, it attracts sooty mold, which covers your plants in black mold. And then they can't make chlorophyll, and then you lose your plants. 2 years ago, we had an unbelievable problem with both the aphids and the sooty mold. We had thousands of aphids on every plant, or probably tens of thousands. And then we had the ants that were farming the aphids for more honeydew, because you can see them, they'll go up and they'll tweak the aphids to make them excrete more honeydew because the ants like to eat it. And then you've got this problem. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. This you can wash off, but if it gets this bad, it takes some work. You kind of have to chip it off. Also on the milkweed, you can get the milkweed bugs, and this shows them in practically every stage of their development. But the milkweed bugs, like I said, they're not going to harm your milkweed. They will, however, they'll get into your milkweed pods and eat all of your seeds. And I encourage everybody to save their milkweed seeds. Just harvest them, and if you can't grow them at home, just toss them into open fields and that sort of place so that they can grow there. But these guys will destroy your seed pods. You can squish them, or you can just knock them into a bucket of soapy water, and that'll take care of them too. So you've got your milkweed ready, and this is what we've been waiting for. This is the mother butterfly, and you can see where she's got the tail end of her body curved around, and she is depositing an egg on the bottom of the leaf. And they're generally at least 90% of them are deposited on the bottom of the leaf. So you have to look on the underside of the leaves to find them. Now and then they'll drop one on top of a leaf. And they're usually one at a time. So they look kind of like this. They're like little creamy domes, but they're tiny. If they run out of room to, deposit just one or two, they'll start depositing bunches of them. And on this plant, I found 30 eggs on one leaf.
Wow.
So once you start seeing the eggs, you also have to look for the tiny caterpillars. Yes, this is a real close-up of the egg, and you can see how cute it is. Its little dome with its little grooves in it. They're very pretty. So when you're looking for the caterpillars, you look for clues. And you can see little milkweed droplets around that little circle. And that's a sign that the tiny little caterpillar has been trying to chew his way through the leaf. From the other side of the leaf, it can look like this. Right in the middle of your leaf, you got this little chew hole. And if you turn those leaves over, there is very likely to be a teeny tiny caterpillar underneath. And when I say they're tiny, I mean tiny. This is 16 of them on one leaf. And this is not a big leaf. The one that is crawling off the leaf at the bottom of the screen, that is a brand new one, probably hatched within minutes of the time this picture was taken. And you can see some of them are a little bigger. They might have, be a few hours old or maybe as much as a day. So how tiny are they? Well, this is one next to the head of a straight pin.
Wow.
And you can see the butterfly, his total length is about the same as a straight pin, and the circumference of his body is going to be smaller than the circumference of the pin part of the pin. And they like to hide. They like to hide in the clusters of buds. So if you're looking for eggs and caterpillars, you need to look in the buds. And when you've been out in your garden working, watch when you come in, because I had come in from the garden in the morning, tossed my shirt on the bed, went back about 6 hours later, and this little guy, who you can see is only as big as the pinstripes on the shirt, is hanging out going, wait a minute, where am I? I was at the all-you-can-eat buffet, and suddenly I can't find anything. So check yourself when you come in and make sure you don't have any hitchhikers. When you find an egg, the best thing to do is to cut off an egg section. And you can tell this is from back in the day when I was raising hundreds of eggs, because I released as many as 584 in one season. So you cut off the section of the leaf that has the egg on it and just put it in a box. You don't have to put the toweling on the bottom of the box unless you want to. But make sure your box is tight, because they can get into the crevices of the lid of a Tupperware box and find their way out when they are first hatched. You don't put air holes in there for them, because that's just another way for them to get out. When you raise the lid, to check on them, you're going to be putting in plenty of air. And how much air can something that small use? So after a couple of days, you look closely and you see this. And, if you don't have this close-up picture of it, you go, uh-oh, my eggs are turning black. Are they dying? What's going on? Because it just looks like a black or gray egg when you look at it. Well, what you're seeing there is the head of the caterpillar as it's about to hatch. And that's what that black spot is at the top of the egg. So this is a good sign when your eggs start turning black. The first thing they will do after they hatch is they will turn around and eat the shell. This is their first meal, and it is just packed full of nutrients. If you have to move one, which is very rare, but you cannot just pick them up, there will be squishing incidents. There's no way you can pick up one of these little things without hurting it. And this is just a little tiny, tiny watercolor brush. And you just slide the very tip of the watercolor brush under the little caterpillar, move him to wherever you want him to go, and slide it back out. And they will sometimes have almost like a spider silk hanging from them. So you've got to be careful that you watch, or they'll go flinging off somewhere you don't want it. Okay, so now we go to bringing up caterpillars. There are 5 what we call instars of any butterfly or moth caterpillar, and you can see the tiniest one is right on the vein in the center of the leaf, and that's our first instar. And as they get bigger, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and those big ones are fatties. The more they eat, the bigger they get, and they get big. They will gain 2,700 times their original weight in a period of 2 weeks. It's kind of like me in the cookie jar. To show you kind of on a practical sense how much they eat, this was a plant I had on my back porch. This is a milkweed plant, and there was maybe a handful of caterpillars on there. 2 days later, this is what we've got. You can see the caterpillars have grown significantly. They are up there munching away, and there is not a single leaf left on that plant. Fortunately for...
How long was that, Jeannie?
2 days.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little overwhelming when you find out how much they eat. And this is also a good reason for not raising a whole lot of them because, I've had to go out to the milkweed garden at 1 o'clock in the morning and fetch more milkweed because I underestimated how much they were going to eat. But fortunately, most of these plants will regenerate pretty quickly. And if you've got enough planted, it's not a big issue for you. You can raise them in the beginning in closed containers like this. You can go to the dollar store and get closed containers. And that's where you want to keep them. And you can raise them entirely in the closed containers, but it's not as healthy for them. So what you want is something like a tent like this. Now, if you're raising them indoors, which is what I do, because even some of the smaller predators can get through tiny holes. You can get them from a butterfly specialist and pay $25, $30 for a tent, or you can go to Walmart and get the same thing, pretty much the same thing. The mesh will be a little bigger for $8. So that's what I do because I bring all of mine in. So it's not going to be a problem with tiny little predators crawling through there. But no matter what you use, remember that you have to keep it clean. You sanitize it before and after every batch of caterpillars with a 19-to-1 bleach solution. That would be 1 part bleach to 19 parts of water. Remember that they can be escape artists because this guy was in a closed container and he pushed his way out and he is just dancing across the top. Sometimes you'll look at your caterpillars and you're going, well, that can't be right because they're totally different colors. Yeah, that's okay. It just depends from caterpillar to caterpillar. Sometimes every caterpillar you'll have will look exactly alike, and sometimes they'll be as different as these two are, but they were both fine. Every few days they will molt. Now, this is a critical time for them. Usually when they molt, they will climb up on the side of something and just kind of hang straight down. And you think there's something wrong with them because they may hang up there for 24 to 48 hours, but you do not want to touch them or move them when they're in the molting process. They will spin silk like a spider web, and you can see his dead skin behind him. And usually they will turn around after they finish molting and eat the dead skin. Not always. Sometimes you'll just find it sitting there. Right after they molted is one of my favorite times because they've got this cute little yellow face. I just love the little yellow face that tells you this is a brand new molted caterpillar. And you can tell too because his front filaments, those are not antennae, they're filaments, and they're folded in. So they're tucked in, and in an hour or two, he'll just look like a regular caterpillar. But it's really fun to be able to catch them at this stage. The anatomy of the caterpillars is fairly simple. They've got 3 pairs of true legs that you can see right up there in the front by the head, which was on the right side. And then they've got 5 pairs of pro legs that they have to use to get around to keep from dragging their middle wherever they go. They've got front and back filaments. This is Monarchs specifically. Other caterpillars will have different arrangements. They're sensory organs, and they help them test whatever it is that they're planning to eat. It's also gives you a clue as to when they have gone from 4th to 5th end stage because the filaments in the front will be long enough to touch down on the plant by the time they're in a late 4th end star. And with a 5th end star, you'll see the filaments start going back and forth in kind of a sweeping motion. Oh, and they breathe through spiracles on the sides. Now, it's a little hard to see, but if you look on each one of those pro legs, on the black stripe, you'll see a little oval opening. And that's the spiracles, and that's where the caterpillars breathe. And if you give them plenty to eat, in about 2 weeks, they are going to be big and fat and happy. Then it's time for them to do this. This is the first time you see this, you go, oh no, what on earth is going on? Is it going to die? And this is what we call their J position. They will make a button out of silk on top of whatever container they are in. And if they're out among the milkweed, usually they will wander away to make their chrysalis. But you can tell when they're going to form their chrysalis because look at those filaments on the front, how they're sort of corkscrewed. This is a sign. If you want to see this happen, you better stand there and wait because it is not going to take long. Then they will start to drop down so that they're more straight again. And they will hang there for as much as 24 hours like that before they actually go into the pupation making. So they'll drop down like this, and then you can see the magic starting. And this really is magic. You can see on the back of his head that green area, and that's the beginning of his chrysalis. So it gets bigger and bigger, and it's still growing. He's almost there. All of his skin is scrunched up to the top. And finally he's done. And if all of his skin is scrunched up there, and then he will start wiggling and jiggling and swaying and twisting back and forth. Looks like me trying to get into a pair of skinny jeans, and he's trying to get that skin to drop off the top of his chrysalis. If it drops off, that's great. If it doesn't, it's nothing to worry about. Usually it will just dry up and drop off later, or you can gently pull it off with a pair of tweezers. But if it stays on there until he closes, then it's not going to be a problem anyway. Now, when they first pupate, this is what they look like. You can see it has that wet look, and you can still see the striping. Then over a few hours, and you can also, when they're first pupated, if you turn them around, you can see where the parts of the butterfly are going to form. Now, what happens is when they're chrysalis stage, they turn into kind of this primordial soup sort of thing. However, while most of the caterpillar just sort of dissolves, there will be specified groups of cells that will turn into the different parts of the butterfly. And you can see here where they're going to be. They will make their chrysalis any place that is handy. Now, remember, you will hear people call them cocoons, but those are for moths. Chrysalises are for butterflies. Here we have one hanging on the side of the flower pot. Here are a bunch of them hanging from netting. This was one of my favorites. Crawled out. This was probably a 5-pound test fishing line. So there is practically nothing to this. So he did his little high wire act across that tiny little fishing line, spun enough of a button to hold his chrysalis up, and there he is, hanging there. Or this is my personal favorite, Barbie's handbag. And you can see the chrysalis hanging there. This is actually where it chose to pupate. This is not my picture. I stole this one from the internet, but I had to have it. And I have seen one also that pupated on the side of a book that was about butterflies. So you just never know where you're going to find them. If they get out of their container, they can be anywhere. This one day, Katie, who's my daughter, she came into the house. She says, "Mom, you've got to come see this." She had just come home from the grocery store. I said, okay. So I go down, and there in the back seat of the car is this butterfly. And I'm going, well, when you were loading the groceries, did she fly in? She said, no, it was already there. I'm going, but how? So we searched all over the car. We have a minivan. And sure enough, in a cubby hole in the trunk or the open space in the back, you can see where the caterpillar got in there and made its chrysalis. And now how the caterpillar got into the back of the car, I will never know. And how it survived with no milkweed. It must have been a nice fat one and ready to go, and decided this was where it was going to crawl into to make its chrysalis. Well, okay. But when they're in their chrysalis stage, if you get the lighting just right, you can see the heartbeat right where this arrow is pointing. And I've actually got this on video too, and it's really cool. Their heartbeat is only about 30 times a minute, unless they're under stress because you're messing with them or whatever, and it will speed up. You can tell the sex of the chrysalis. You can tell whether it's going to be a male or a female by that little slit right down below those two black dots. And it is longer on the female than it is on the male. But you need a magnifier to do this, unless you've got really good eyes, which I gave up years ago. So the chrysalis will last from about 10 days to 2 weeks. It's going to depend on your weather and your lighting conditions and all of that stuff. When I was living in Florida, I had them eclose in as little as 5 days. But that's really unusual. But you can tell this one is going to pop that the day after this picture was taken, because it's more of a cloudy look, and you can actually see the wings of the butterfly. And this is just another thing that I think is totally magical, that you can see the butterfly in there. And the next morning, it looks like this. I mean, they are so beautiful. They just look like pieces of jewelry. And this is another thing, if you want to see this happen, you don't leave. Now, it may take an hour for him, once you see him like this, or it may take a matter of seconds, and you'll see along that ridge dome at the top, it will crack. And once that crack is there, it's going to be no time at all, because I've looked at one, walked off to get a cup of coffee, come back, and it was done. Missed the whole thing. So what will happen is, first the head will drop out, And then very shortly after that, the body will drop out. After they emerge, they will look like this. And the ones that have newly eclosed, and that's what we call emerging among butterfly people, is called eclosing. But they will have a very big fat body. And I get into this probably more in my advanced program. But the body is so fat because that's where the fluid is that they will pump out to expand the wings, which again, it's remarkable to see something coming out of a chrysalis the size of a jelly bean. And then 5 minutes later, it's hanging there like this. And you think, how does this happen? And this is why I call my website Magical Monarchs, because this is all magic to me. They need to stay like this to dry for at least 4 hours. Some people say keep them 24 hours, but I keep mine at least 4. Then they'll start getting antsy and I don't want them flying around and battering their wings. Okay, it's easy to tell the sex of monarchs, not so easy with other butterflies. But this one, you can see those 2 black spots right next to his body on his hind wings. The oval-shaped black spots will tell you that this is male. The female do not have the black spots, and their veining in their wings is much thicker. Now and then you'll run into a problem, even if you've gotten it as far as the chrysalis and ready to emerge stage, it will slip and fall. And unless you're there when it happens, you're probably going to lose your butterfly. This is why we tell everybody to use netted enclosures or have an enclosure where you have something running up the side of it. Like people will want to put them in a glass jar. Well, you have to have something that they can climb, and they cannot climb the sides of a glass jar. So if they slip, they need to be able to climb. This one actually eclosed in a plastic box back before I knew what I was doing. But I was there when it happened, and I was able to take him out and hang him from my towel bar in the bathroom. And that's where he finished expanding and drying his wings. But if they have no place to climb to, then you're going to lose them. Generally, they don't eat for about 24 hours. So if you're having bad weather, you don't have to worry about feeding them. If you're having one of those famous rainstorms that hangs on for days and you can't release them, then you can give them butterfly or hummingbird nectar, or soak it into a cotton ball and put it in front of them, and they use their feet to taste it with. And then they'll know that they can drink the syrup out of the cotton ball or even out of a tiny little dish. I've used pill bottle caps or whatever that have been gleaned. And they also like Gatorade. They really like the green apples. So, if that's what you don't have any honey or sugar to make syrup with, feed them Gatorade. It works. They eat through that proboscis, the curled up, almost looks like another antenna in front of her face. Right after they eclose, this will be split. And you can see where hers is still split. But what she'll do is those labial palps, which are the fuzzy things right on the side of her face, the black and white things, she will use that to take the proboscis back and forth and zip her proboscis. This is Pixie. Pixie was a troublemaker. That was actually her in the picture before, because she decided that she was going to pupate when she was merely a 4th instar caterpillar. And I saw her hanging there at the top. I said, you get down from the top of that and go eat some more because you're not big enough. And she said, poo-poo to you. And she went ahead and made her chrysalis, which is about the size of a jelly belly. It's the smallest chrysalis I've ever seen. She eclosed almost perfectly. She had just a bit of a rumple in her wing, but not very much. She was free of OE. She did manage to zip her proboscis. And so I took a picture of her. You can see where she's got her proboscis down into the flower of this butterfly bush. So now you've done everything you can. And you think to yourself, well, I've spent a month at this. How long is it going to live? Well, in the early season of the monarchs, you spent about as long a time taking care of it as it's going to live. Generally, it will live somewhere between 3 and 6 weeks. It just kind of depends, but they will go through about 4 generations of living for such a short time. And during these generations, their only purpose in life is to eat and procreate. That's why it's so important that we have milkweed and nectar flowers. But starting around the end of August, they go into the last generation, and we call this the Methuselah generation or the super generation. those are the ones that eclose very late in the season, and they will make the migration to either Mexico or California, and they will live for as much as 9 months. Now, fortunately for me, in the area where we are, we only see those that are on their southern migration back. So all of the eggs that hatch here are going to be part of the Methuselah generation, which I find to be just a really cool thing, because I know my babies are the ones that are probably going to be on their way to Mexico. When they get there, they will overwinter there, and they will be in diapause during that time, which just means that they won't be procreating. They will not lay any eggs in this last generation because they don't have time or energy for that. So all they're doing is nectaring as much as they can and flying. And they can fly 25, 30 miles an hour. There was one that was tagged it was caught, interestingly enough, both in the morning and at the end of the day, and it had moved 235 miles. So to think of those tiny little wings going that far, again, it's absolutely miraculous. So these are the ones that will overwinter. Now, this is kind of gives you an idea of the migratory patterns. As you can see, they are obviously going north in the spring. During the during the summer and the fall, they will come back and they will kind of make a funnel. The eastern population will make a funnel that goes down into central Mexico. And the migration can be as much as 3,000 miles because some of them will start in Canada. And that's a long ways to have to fly. And the ones on the other side are going to California. At night, they will cluster together like this to keep warm, because we know the temperatures are going to be dropping during the flight time. And as long as it doesn't get below about 42 degrees on their way, they'll be okay. So that's the way they grow. You've done everything you can. You've released them. You've checked for OE, but again, that's part of my other class. This is just beginner stuff. So now what? Well, these are other things you can do. Again, planting milkweed, starting a butterfly garden. You can do it at home. You can do it at school. Convince your park and rec peoples to start butterfly gardens in their parks. You can talk to your mayor of your community about becoming a Monarch certified community. You can put plants at the office. Even if you live in a community where all you have is maybe a doorstep or a mailbox or whatever, just put one potted plant out there that they like. Because when they're flying, even one potted plant by itself that has a nectar flower in it is going to be a welcome relief to a hungry butterfly. So you don't have to do something big. You don't have to go through all this process that we've talked about, but at least just give them something to eat. Please don't use insecticides, because that is just nothing but trouble. Talk to everybody you know, tell them about this program, because I'm willing to do it for anybody. I don't charge for it. Tell them about how endangered the monarchs are. You can start a registered way station, and if you'd like to do that, you go to monarchwatch.org, and they will ask you specific questions about what you've got in the way of feeding them, whether you have nectar plants, whether you have milkweed plants, whether you have sources for them to get water, that sort of thing. And they will give you a registered registration number, and you can get a sign that says you've got a official a Monarch way station. You can name it anything you want. That's up to you. Mine is called Kaleidoscope Kisses, because, known to very few people, a group of butterflies is called a kaleidoscope. So I think that is just perfect, because that's what they look like. When you watch them flying by, they look like something you would see through a kaleidoscope. So that's my take on butterfly kisses. If you go with Monarch Watch, or there are some other organizations too, you can actually register your sightings, especially the first ones you see, the last ones you see, how many eggs you're finding. So again, you don't have to be bringing in eggs and raising them to help, but just keeping an eye on how many caterpillars and eggs and that sort of stuff, and reporting it back to the agencies that track them. Remember that you count your successes and not your failures. This would be Luke Skywalker. I found Luke one day on a completely eaten dry milkweed plant, and he had a hole in his side where somebody had completely pulled off one of his pro legs. He was dripping hemolymph, which is the insect version of blood. It's green and clear. So I looked at him and I thought, oh, I don't really know if there's any hope for this guy at all, but I can't just leave him out here. So I brought him in and put him in a container by himself with plenty of fresh milkweed, and he stopped dripping the hemolymph, but he didn't eat anything for like a day or two. And then he started eating, and he ate and he ate and he ate. And the last time I saw him, this was how Luke looked. And my other big success story that I talk about was Dirk. Now, Dirk eclosed looking like this. He had two very funky wings. And again, I thought, well, obviously he couldn't fly unless he wanted to fly in circles, and that's no fun flying your whole life in circles. I did check him for OE and he was negative, so I was not worried about him putting spores anyplace. So what do? Well, we give him a wing transplant. I just happen to have two left-sided monarch wings because, you know, you go to the kitchen drawer and you pull out your monarch wings. Some super glue, some cornstarch, a way to hold them down, and we cut the two wings that were deformed back completely to just a little bit of wing space and put on a little super glue, put a little cornstarch on there to keep his wings from sticking together because that's not a good way to fly. And he stayed around the garden for about 24 hours. And then I saw him fly a circle overhead and I knew he was going to be okay. And later that day, he was gone. And I have no illusions that he probably made it to Mexico, but he was still able to live his best butterfly life. So if you do all of these things that we've been talking about, you may become a crazy monarch person or a crazy butterfly person, or you just can't get rid of them because they just want to stay with mom. And you might even have a crazy monarch dog. This is my old friend Bubbles. We no longer have her, but we will be teaching Gracie about the monarchs. And here is all of my information. If you need anything, you can call me, you can email me. I will always get back to you. I will not leave you ignored. If you know anybody that wants to do this presentation, I do it for garden clubs, I do it for schools, you know, whatever, service organizations, anything. Because the more you talk to people, the better off we're all going to be, and the better off the monarchs are. So if you have any questions, I would be glad to take them.
Jeannie, if I can jump in there real quick, just to let everybody know also, Jeannie is also